Dave Wilkes here. A pleasure to be with you again this morning. And I'd like to welcome you to our member-only briefing on Build's latest research report, entitled rather provocatively, Forecast for Failure, how a broken forecasting system is at the root of the GTAHA's housing shortage, and most importantly, how it can be fixed. The report examined how forecasting and the modeling that goes with that has contributed to housing supply and affordability challenge in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and outer ring communities. It also makes several practical recommendations on how to improve the foundation of that forecasting that informs planning, which is at the core of how we plan for housing and commercial spaces. I'm delighted to have with me the lead author of the report, Dr. Mike Moffat, who will highlight the key findings, but more importantly, what it means for our members and our business and the work that the association does as we advocate for policies that facilitate increased housing supply and affordability. Dr. Moffat is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute, a national research network and policy think tank that is based at the University of Ottawa. The Institute delivers world-class research and work with public and private partners, all to advance practical policies and market solutions for a stronger, cleaner economy. Mike is also an assistant professor in business, economics, and public policy group at the Ivey Business School at Western University. Mike, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I enjoy our conversations, and I'm looking forward to you sharing this important research findings with our members. Over to you, sir.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for attending at 8:30 in the morning on a short week. So let's get right to it. So here's basically what we're going to go through. So I'm going to give sort of a big picture outline that talks not just about this research, but a couple of other papers that we did, studies that we conducted at SPI. So we did Forecast for Failure. We did one with the Ontario home builders called Baby Needs New Home, and a third one that was released just last week called 1 Million New Ontarians. So the first thing that we need to understand is that Ontario's population in the 5 years before the pandemic grew by about 1 million people. And this is a lot. That in any given 5-year period, we tend to grow by about 600,000. So all of a sudden we grew by 1 million people. So that's an extra 400,000 people that we need to house. Despite all of this extra population growth, new home construction, however, didn't keep pace. We didn't increase the number of homes that were built in the GTA. There were some increases outside of the GTA in smaller communities like Lucan and Thorold and Woodstock and so on. But in the Toronto area, not much changed, despite the fact that we had this big population growth. So that sort of raises a question that we look at Forecast for Failure of why is that? Why did we not respond to this population growth? And I believe, and the sort of thesis of Forecast for Failure is that the growth plan was based on bad forecasts, that the growth plan that governs the GTA should have seen this increased population growth happening and responded to it, but it didn't. So because of this, we're seeing a lack of homes causing an exodus of young families out of the GTA. We're seeing particularly Toronto, York, and Peel. We're seeing people leave and move to the rest of the province, and it's primarily, but not exclusively, but it's primarily parents of young children. And all of this was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated these trends. And again, this is a problem because we've created a GTA that is essentially not friendly for families. That people are having to decide to either continue working in the GTA or and not have kids, or have kids and move to a Woodstock, a Stratford, a London, or so on. And finally, I would suggest that these trends are going to continue. The Ontario Ministry of Finance expects that population growth is going to continue. We will likely have some ups and downs as far as housing prices go. We may have a correction, but the long-term shortages of housing aren't going away unless we really change how we build housing in this province, and in particular in the GTA. So let's talk about the growing province. So here I've shown basically how many people does Ontario add in any 5-year period. If we go back to the 80s, we had a big baby boom. So our population grew quite a bit in the 1980s. After that, we would grow anywhere by about 600,000 to 800,000 people every 5 years. Now we're growing by over 1 million. And the reason why we're growing over by a million is that we're having an international student boom. That's that sort of green area called net non-permanent residents. Though I would suggest that that term is misleading. And it's the term non-permanent is misleading. That basically what we've done in Canada over the last decade is we've created a system that uses our colleges and universities as a pathway to permanent residency. So students come, they from overseas, they come to a college, a university, they graduate, they work 3 years after graduation, and then they gain permanent residency. So we're bringing over a lot of really talented 17, 18, and 19-year-olds who are planning to stay and are planning to raise a family 10 to 15 years from now. So we need to prepare for that. So new home building is not keeping pace with this population growth. So if we look at home building, and this is all unit types, so this is everything from high-rise apartments to single detached to you name it, that despite having record population growth, the number of housing units we added in this province only went up by about 10% and was significantly lower than it was 20 years ago and significantly lower than the baby boom in the 1980s. So housing construction did respond a little bit, but only by about 10% and mostly outside of the GTA. So if we think in terms of not number of people, but number of families or number of households, well, it should be that for every one new household, you have one new house. And historically speaking, that's largely been true. That blue shows the number of housing completions in a 5-year period, and the red bar shows how many new households were formed. And these things tend to keep track with each other, that, sometimes we build more houses and we have new households, and vice versa. Sometimes we have more new households than new houses. But over the last 5 years, we've built about 350,000 unit types, and a lot of those are, bachelor condos, despite the fact that we've had about 415,000 new families. So we were off by about 65,000 units. And the type of units that were being built were disproportionately small, smaller units relative to the 1980s and 1990s. So, and if we look at the city of Toronto itself, again, we've got this massive population increase, about 60% over average. I defy you to tell any difference between these two bars. I assure you that they are different. They are. I did not just put the same data twice. They are different. But basically, the city of Toronto did more of the same. It did not change the number or types of homes that were built between at the beginning of the decade versus the end of the decade, despite the fact that we had this population boom. So we basically, the city of Toronto responded by not really changing a thing. So why is that? Why were we caught sleeping? And this goes to the paper Forecast for Failure. So in Ontario, we have a growth plan for the GTA that goes back to 2005 and had a major update in 2017. And this update is important. And the growth plan is divided out into two parts. That one, we have the GTHA, so the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, as shown by yellow. And then we have what they call the outer ring, which is this area, this kind of orangey, pinky color. And this Ontario growth plan governs all the sort of municipal plans under it, that the municipal plans have to conform to the Ontario growth plan. And the idea behind the growth plan is to ensure that the amount of housing matches population growth and matches need, right? So you don't underbuild, but you don't overbuild either, right? That's kind of the point of this whole exercise. But that exercise, again, if you want to make sure you're not underbuilding or overbuilding, you have to be able to predict how many people are going to be moving to the GTAH. And the growth plan has consistently got it wrong, but consistently got it wrong in one direction, that it consistently underestimates the number of people or the population growth of the GTAH, particularly from international sources, so immigration and international students. So if we look at the period 2016 to 2021, the last 5 years, the original forecast for the growth plan said, we think the GTAH is going to bring in about 398,000 people from outside of Canada. When those numbers were updated by Hempson in 2012, they increased that. They said, actually, it's probably going to be closer to 480,000. Well, it turns out that the number was actually over 600,000. So Canada, the GTA brought in over 100,000 extra people from international sources than the growth plan predicted. So, and again, those 100,000 people all need to live somewhere, but we weren't expecting them to arrive. And the point of forecast for failure is we should have expected them to rise. This is not something that happened by accident. This was planned. And when I say it was planned, the federal government under Harper, but continuing under Trudeau, made some very important changes to how immigration works in Canada. The first is that they allowed international students, when they came in, that basically they could work off campus without applying for a visa. And the second change in January 2015 is it allowed those international students after 3 years to apply for express entry and gain permanent residency. And this was on purpose. And I think these were actually really good changes. One of the issues we've always had in Canada is with our immigration system is foreign credential recognition. Right, that somebody gets a credential from overseas, and our employers don't really know what to do with it, don't know the value of it, and so on. So the Harper government it said, well, that didn't make any sense. So instead of bringing people over when they're 28 or 29 with credentials that we're not really sure what to do with, why don't we bring people over at 17, 18, 19, have them get their credentials in Canada and then immigrate? Because then our employers will know, what a degree from University of Toronto or a diploma from Sheridan is worth. So I think this is a really good change. But for whatever reason, the Ontario government under Wynne wasn't paying attention. I still don't entirely know what was going on, but they never referenced any of this. They never took any of this into account in the 2017 growth plan. And they were using population forecasts that predated these changes. So the federal government basically overhauled how immigration works in Canada, but the provincial government didn't take any of that into account when updating the growth plan. And I think it got us to where we are today. And second thing, the issue with the growth plan is the growth plan tends to also overestimate the number of housing units that we will have in the GTAH. So if we look at the year 2021, our original forecast from 2005 said, we'll have about 2.8 million, 2.86 million units. When those numbers were updated in 2012, it said, actually, it's going to be closer to 2.76 million. And then finally, the real number turned out to be closer to 2.73 million. So think about this for a second. Our population is growing faster than the growth plan forecasts, but our new home construction is actually growing slower than the growth plan predicts it would. That's a problem when you're adding more people but fewer homes. That's going to get you a housing shortage. So, that is the big sort of summary of the research, where We say, okay, despite the federal government making all these changes, none of it filters through the growth plan. And secondly, that the growth plan is really based on a bunch of best case scenarios. So there's no wiggle room in it. There's no, federal budgets, for instance, have contingencies built in. Say, okay, if our numbers are wrong, we're going to build in a cushion that will give us some breathing room. There's no breathing room in the growth plan. It's just like, here's the number, this is it. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. So finally, how this has manifested itself, and I'll go through these pretty quick, is there's a large exodus of young families leaving the city of Toronto. So this is just a number of people moving within Ontario. The blue line shows how many people on net are leaving the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And that's, we're seeing more and more people leave. About 50,000 people leave the GTAH on net. And where they're going to partly is the outer ring, partly is places like the Niagara region and so on, Niagara region, Barrie, and so on. But where they're increasingly going to is southwestern Ontario. They're basically going down the 403, going down the 401. They're going to Woodstock, to Stratford, to London, to so on. They're going really far away from the GTA. So here's another conception of this. This is something I did for Maclean's magazine back in December. This isn't looking at migration. This is just looking at how many kids are there under the age of 5 that live in different parts of Ontario. The little purple area is the city of Toronto. And as you see, that the number of kids who live in the city of Toronto peaked in 2013 and has kind of cratered since then. We look at Peel and York, it's gone down as well, but it's starting to dip back up a little bit. But if you look at southwestern Ontario, and by southwestern Ontario, it's basically you can draw a line between Barrie and London. The number of kids under 5 there is absolutely booming. It's skyrocketing, and it's not skyrocketing because because Guelph is having a baby boom. It's skyrocketing because you've got all these U-Haul trucks leaving Toronto, Mississauga, and Brampton, and moving across southwestern Ontario. And I want to reiterate, all of this was happening before the pandemic. Everything I just told you has nothing to do with the pandemic whatsoever. It all predates the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated this trend. So if you look at, this is the number of people who are moving. These are the number of kids under the age of 5 who are moving from one part of the province to the other. Look at that big change in Toronto, the city of Toronto, between 2019, the year before the pandemic, 2020, and then 2021. Last year, we saw on net, 10,000 kids under the age of 5 leave the city of Toronto. We saw an additional on net 2,000 kids leave York and Peel to other parts of the province. Sometimes they're staying in the GTA, sometimes they're going to Durham or Halton or so on, but a lot of the times they're going to the Woodstocks and Londons and Tillsonburgs of the province. I would suggest that this is a problem. So Ontario growth is expected to accelerate. Remember when I said that we grew by 1 million people? Well, the Ontario Ministry of Finance has population projections for the province, and they're basically saying expect more of the same. That they are saying for every 5-year period, Ontario is going to continue to grow by 1 million people or more. And I would point out that the Ontario Ministry of Finance made these projections before the recent announcement by the federal government to increase immigration targets. So these are already out of date, and they're out of date by being too low. So again, we're going to have so much population growth that we need to house people, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing this research, and we're so excited to see the provincial government with the task force and the federal government with the housing accelerator start to take these issues seriously. So if we look at what the Ministry of Finance is saying for the GTA, so this is minus Hamilton, they're saying that they're expecting the GTA's population growth to be higher than it has been in recent memory. So that's going to be a lot of housing that we need. So we did with the Ontario Home Builders Association, we looked at the GTA and basically said, how many new homes are we going to need to support that population growth that's being predicted? And what we found was that for every year, we're going to need about 40 to 50,000 additional homes. And you can see the numbers here for 5-year periods, and we break it down between low and medium density and high-rise apartments. This is what we're forecasting the demand from population growth to be based on the Ontario Ministry of Finance numbers, which again are a little bit out of date because they don't take into account the recent immigration changes. So the takeaways from this is that Ontario's population boom is projected to continue. Our work suggests that this is going to create a need for 1 million net new homes. The provincial task force has actually put the number at 1.5 million, and I actually think that's a prudent thing to do. That's probably closer to the truth. Young families are looking for new housing. That's who's moving across the province. That's where the biggest shortages are. They're housing for family. If we don't build those houses, we're going to lose talent. We're already seeing out-migration of young families to places like Atlantic Canada and Alberta and the United States. That's probably going to continue. This is going to put a lot of pressure on municipalities to provide the infrastructure for the provincial government to provide the schools and so on that's necessary to support this growth. So are municipalities prepared? Are home builders prepared? Is our labor market prepared? My dad was a retired sheet metal worker, HVAC worker. There's a lot of guys in his cohort who are retiring or about to retire. Do we have the labor force necessary to build all these homes? So I think that's enough for me from now. I feel like I kind of fire hose a lot of information at you, but I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to the questions.
Hi, Dr. Moffat.